My pleasure.
Actually, it wasn't actually
it was for a
out.
cheesecake. Opening blips aside. No, I mean, I decided the idea to give this talk when I realized that in a lot of the other talks about economics, you referenced America and you referenced how it was the most important country in the world, but none of you actually went into any depth about it. So I thought it'd be worthwhile going over in some depth probably the world's current leading superpower as a matter of economic interest and general course discipline interest. Okay, I'm just going to briefly run through some background and then we're going to go into issues since I realize many of you don't know much about American history. Okay, I'll try and keep it short. The primary and most salient aspect of the American Constitution is its beauty. It is a fantastically written and wholly philosophically sound document. I mean, despite the Founding Fathers' trappings due to their time on issues like slavery, it is a remarkably forward-thinking document. It is the first experiment of its kind, a liberal democracy conscientiously concerned with the freedoms of its citizens. The Constitution predated the French Revolution, which is as much a result of, which is a directly comparable contemporary event. But America was as much a result of its bloody war of independence as France was of its own upheaval. And in 1776, America declared its independence when John put his Hancock on it, as the phrase goes. The Americans used Hancock as a signature, along with 55 others. And in 1783, America seceded from the Kingdom of Great Britain. So, in short, I'm going to talk to you about what has gone wrong in practical terms for America when considering their constitutional policy.
Such a freak.
I will send you out of the classroom. Contrary to popular belief, the US Constitution was not founded out of indignation or self-righteousness caused by American succession, rather out of necessity. In the 1780s, there were only 13 states represented on the modern-day flag by the horizontal red and white bars. And they were comprised of two major sectors, which you can see here. The United States and the Spanish North America. Oh, how do you put your hands touch me? And once again, the one technology goes straight over my head. Spanish North America and the United States. The United States contained Delaware, Virginia, Georgia, etc. The English-populated part of North America. Spanish North America contained everything from what was then Louisiana and the Floridas, all the way through to the Pacific Seaboard, including Alta and Baja California. Baja California is now what we call Mexico. Why is it on
time on it?
No, I don't. Maybe it's just telling me to move. Maybe it's just telling me to carry on. And this whole area, Louisiana, would later become American property under the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson. In the infancy of the US, there was very little union between the 13 states under the Articles of Confederation, a document which vaguely solicited some cooperation between the states. It reads, "The states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, for their common defence, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding them to assist each other against all force offered to, or attacks made upon them, or any of them, on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretence whatever." Drafted in 1776, it was proving to be wholly unsatisfactory. At that point, the states were governed by something loosely resembling a federal government, which required tax. However, the problem with this, for reasons I'll come to later, is none of the states paid all of their tax. Indeed, Georgia did not pay any. This created a multitude of problems for the old US, most notably national security. By that point, in the mid-1780s, any country with a sizable navy could have taken over the US. Indeed, had it not been for the ally of America and Spain, we could well be calling it El Estados Unidos, which is what the Spanish call it now, or any other Franco-influenced name. Adding to their problems, because of a lack of a real constitution, the US could not form a trade. What the hell is touching you with your I did not touch it. The US, adding to their problems, the US did not have the power to sign a trade agreement with the Spanish, who controlled most of America. And so therefore, the Spanish closed New Orleans, which you can see there, which is the US biggest port and most prolific port, to Western farmers, which was financially disastrous. Now, this was clearly an unacceptable state of affairs. The federal government had no money, no power, and no support from its member states. And in May of 1787, they sought to replace the ineffectual Articles of Confederation and replace it with something that gave them a greater degree of power over their own affairs. And the Constitutional Convention gathered in Philadelphia to frame the new Constitution, a document which eventually 39 of the 55 delegates signed. And a significant part of this was the Connecticut Compromise, an agreement which laid out the framework of representation in these United States of America, as they were very fond of calling it at the time. And it was James Madison who successfully suggested a bicameral system, which means two houses for you politics students, like we have in this country, detailing proportional representation in the lower house, but power to be weighted equally between states in the upper house. These are the House of Representatives and Senate, respectively, collectively known as Congress. Interestingly, popular election of Senate wasn't actually standardized until the ratification of the 17th Amendment in 1913. Having been decided by landowners, etc. before. The Constitution was finally created on the 17th of September 1787 and was ratified in June the next year. Possibly in reaction to the non-codified British Constitution. I mean, it's a common fallacy that the British Constitution is not written down. It is written down, it's just not codified. It's been written down many times. The US comprehensively and explicitly set out the terms of a new nation in a wholly unambiguous manner. Because of this, there's always been humour poking fun at the Constitution and its amendments, like the old joke about the Second Amendment, where the two founding fathers are sitting in the stuffy room on a hot day trying to get some work done. And one of them says to the others, "Bloody hell, it's hot in here. Yeah. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and undo my collar." And the other one goes, yeah, I think you're right. There should be something in the law about that. Every citizen has the right to roll up the sleeves on a hot day. Yeah, it's good, but it's not very smooth. How about the right to bear arms? That was the worst joke in the whole talk. I'm very sorry. The right to bear arms. It's the Second Amendment. The rednecks love it. Okay, since then there have been 27 amendments to the Constitution. Actions which are covered under Article 5 of it. Please do not bury your head in your hands. I promise you that is the worst joke in the whole talk. They range from women's suffrage, the right to bear arms, the right for all races to vote, which was ratified in 1870 after the Civil War. And there is really no point in going into that. Someone asked me today if they should read the Constitution. The Supreme Court judges, of the 9 of them, I think probably maybe one of them has read the entire Constitution. It's a very dull document, and it will really not enlighten you as to any of it, because it's very complicatedly written. Now, the United States had long been frustrated by sovereign rule from Westminster, as it had been a Commonwealth. More importantly, because of the lack of representation of their interests. At the Philadelphia Convention, the mantra of choice was no taxation without representation. This was important in both the War of Independence and the subsequent lack of taxes received from member states. If the citizens were paying taxes, many of whom were artisans and agricultural workers, they expected their financial interests to be considered when creating legislature that wholly affected both their business and their livelihood. They needed a federal government which was powerful and autonomous, so they were not constrained by the irrelevance of European law. And this issue is still poignant today. For instance, in the case of Puerto Rico, if any of you have been following that, in 1898, the island became American property. In 1917, its citizens became Americans. They have a level of autonomous rule, but they are legislated by the US federal government. They adhere to the Constitution, they're taxable to the US, and indeed they're subsidized by the US. Yet they're not allowed to vote in federal elections, such as the one that happened earlier this month. And there's long been speculation that Puerto Rico will become the 51st state. And on the 6th of November, election day, they had a referendum as to whether they wanted to keep their current status or not. It consists of 2 questions. The first question asked voters whether they wanted to maintain their current status under the territorial clause of the US Constitution. The second question posed 3 alternate status options if the first question was approved: statehood, independence, or free association. Interestingly, none of which were what they are at the moment. For the first question, 54% voted against the current Commonwealth status, and in the second question, over 61% favoured statehood. However, it wasn't legally binding, and President Obama has no obligation to attend to it. Indeed, it's probably the case that it will not. It would financially be a very silly decision. The fundamental issue here is clearly accountability. The Founding Fathers saw the obvious danger in empowering those who are not accountable to the people that they legislated for. And this was demonstrated when you consider that in 1767, the British Parliament decreed that it could strike down any law it desired. The colonists had brought with them an English political tradition, which dated back to at least 1215 and the Magna Carta. The people have certain rights that should be immune to political trespass regardless of momentary desires of a democratic majority. For those of you who are politics students, this is the tyranny of the majority. The concern was not only that the colonists were underrepresented in Parliament, but, more fundamentally, that Parliament assumed unlimited powers to meddle in the private lives of individuals, whether represented or not. Although the Founding Fathers were determined to establish a government that was democratic in the limited sense that political decisions could not ignore citizen input, they had no intention of creating a government that was fully responsive to majority interests. In many ways, the Constitution was designed to frustrate the political will of the majority. The most obvious example of this is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, as they came to be known. These amendments guarantee certain individual freedoms against political infringement, regardless of a majority will. If, for example, freedom of speech and press was dependent on majority, then many unpopular but possibly important ideas would never be disseminated. Indeed, the example that is always used, if a university lecturer had to submit all his lectures for approval, how many controversial ideas that would expose one to a good university education would actually be exposed to them? Very few, I contend. And it is here that we arrive at our first subversion, the Senate and the Supreme Court. In the Senate, every state holds equally weighted power. The problem with this arises when considering that California, a state of 37.5 million, is roughly 50 times larger than Wyoming. 50 times more populous, I mean, in terms of geography. A state of 560,000. As an issue of fairness, is it right that so few Wyomingites are as obviously represented as so many Californians? This leads to issues like dilution of representation and disparity of power. And what they're essentially saying here is that in terms of the Senate, one Wyomingite is as powerful as 50 Californians. And this leads to some obvious problems. The reason for this is the Connecticut Compromise, which I briefly mentioned earlier, which is an agreement between the more and less populous states of the old US. And clearly it is in the interest of the less populous states to be as represented as the more populous ones. But is it necessarily optimum for the successful discourse of federal government? A similar issue, which has been raised every 4 years since 2000 without fail. I watched the election coverage of the last election, and they brought this up more times than I can count, is the Electoral College. It is wholly possible, as it happened in the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, that one candidate may earn the popular vote, but have fewer Electoral College votes. Sorry, yes, they may earn the popular vote, but may have fewer Electoral College votes, so they will lose. Bush won the election with 47.87% of the popular vote and 271 Electoral College votes, beating Al Gore's 48.38% and 266 Electoral College votes. And for the majority of the night of the 6th of November and the morning of the 7th, Mitt Romney was beating Obama in the popular vote, despite the fact that Obama finished with a landslide of more than 100 Electoral College votes. Now, equally, in the Supreme Court, judges are appointed, not elected, appointed for life. The most significant issue with the court is that the judges can, by a majority rule, strike down any law it desires on the basis of precedent. And this works that if they reject a law once, then they have to reject it in future on the basis of fairness. And this can even be achieved through a 5-4 vote among the 9 judges. These clear subversions of the Constitution have caused any number of controversies and injustices over the years. And one is forced to wonder what would have happened if the Constitution was actually adhered to. And here we come to our second subversion. In 1789, the First Amendment was drafted. It didn't take them long to make the First Amendment. And it included the phrase, "Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This sentiment was later reiterated by Jefferson in an 1803 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, whereby he wrote, was on the board. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith, for his worship, and that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only, and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people which declared that the legislature shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. It seems to me that Jefferson, while not wholly responsible for the First Amendment, was an atheist of his time. And needless to say, this was the 1780s. Admitting such a thing would be tantamount to disqualifying yourself from social interaction and, more important, political office. Now, as with other aspects of the framing of the Constitution, liberal thinking is wholly present, but constrained by the times. So, I put it to you, why would America, as a wholly devout nation, built on puritanical Christianity, willingly separate their religion and their politics? Two ideological areas of life which seem to complement each other, at least in the eyes of the Puritans. Now, in reality, there are political, philosophical, and economic reasons for this. Firstly, when you're considering the church, it was not one church. During the 1700s, America was experiencing a religious revolution. There was growing separation in the Protestant faith between evangelicalism, Baptists and Methodists, etc., and traditionalism, Anglicans, Quakers, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, etc. This was called the Great Awakening, which is an event very rarely written about in history books because it's of such complexity for a start, and it's such a subjective area of history, I suppose. And it was an event that happened in much of the English-speaking world. It was most pronounced in North America, and this was because evangelicalism sought to convert blacks, which were a wholly uneducated group of society, and they did this by taking an emotional approach to worship as opposed to an intellectual one. This led to traditionalism being wholly left behind, at least in terms of church attendance figures, and evangelicalism claiming the southern part of the United States. However, there were still significant numbers on either side of the divide, and to lose one faction would be politically disastrous for any party that tried to stand. Therefore, the only option was to remain impartial and to maintain political solidarity to avoid creating religious schisms on the political spectrum. Now, philosophically, the Founding Fathers rejected the idea of the sovereign, the idea that they were God's representative on earth. They saw these ideas as being simultaneous and codependent. If no one can claim to be God's representative, how can a government endorse a particular religious position? And economically, to endorse the views of one faction would be to deny the other. As I talked about before, America had already had its fingers burnt once through a lack of taxation. It could certainly not afford to risk religious abstention from financial contribution, or protect itself against a religious revolt, both of which would have led it straight back to the days of the War of Independence. Now, look at this standard dollar bill. It is the symbol, it is one of the great symbols of Americanness. Everyone looks at that and thinks of it as one of the great bastions of the new republic. What could possibly be unconstitutional about it? It has one error. Keep it to yourselves if you know. That. In God we trust. To endorse God is a direct contradiction of the First Amendment. In modern times, the ramifications of this have been that as America becomes an increasingly multicultural and multi-faith nation, the nation and its constitution have become the subject of mockery because of the disingenuous nature of purporting to be accepting to all, but in reality, favouring some. This simple piece of religious anachronism can be perceived to be fundamentally undermining the entire practice of the Constitution, which is wholly damaging. And not only is it damaging, it is unnecessary. The Founding Fathers drafted a document which has a great deal of solidarity, taken as a whole, and can just as easily have been adhered to. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Pledge of Allegiance. Yes or no? And for those of you who don't, it goes, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Yeah, the cool, resplendent words of the framers of the Constitution, I hear you think. Not quite. It was first published in a children's magazine in 1892, in the September issue, if you're interested, in an article about public schools celebrating Columbus Day. It was written by Francis Bellamy, who was a pastor. You see all those problems here. In short, the idea was to sell magazines to school children and flags to schools. A capitalist monstrosity of truly American proportions. Interestingly, the original pledge read, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Spot the difference. The addition of under God only came in Okay.
Sorry, what's the difference? When it says under God.
The one says. The addition of under God only came in 1952 when a lawyer in Chicago added it, claiming Abraham Lincoln used it in his Gettysburg Address. Now this is tenuous at best, considering that there are no mention of God in any of the official transcripts of the address, and it would seem very unlikely that there would be, considering that it begins with 7 years ago our fathers brought forth onto this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and to the conception that, and to the proposition that all men are created equal. A wholly liberal stance, I think you'll agree. But why would it be important that a school child pledge contained religious sympathy? It seems wholly unimportant. But the Pledge of Allegiance has become integral in state functions and events, and in local government meetings regularly too. And in fact, many schools, I know even the school my cousins attend in San Diego, which is a public school, requires them to recite it every morning. And the Founding Fathers recognized that it was very dangerous to associate the state with religion. But this is precisely what's been done. And the question you have to ask is, if America could ignore one part of its constitution, what else can it ignore? Now, I realize this is the faculty of Langston economists, and a lot of you here are economists, so I'll throw you a bone. Professor Dwight R. Lee is the world's leading constitutional economist, and he is the head of economics at the University of Georgia. He writes, it is hard to argue with the success of the US Constitution. The history of the United States in the decades after the ratification of the Constitution was one of limited government and individual liberty, major increases in the size of the US in terms of population and geography, and unprecedented growth in economic well-being. With the major exception of, and to a large extent in spite of, the unfortunate legacy of slavery and the Civil War, millions of diverse people were able to pursue their individual objectives through harmonious and productive interaction with one another. The opportunities created by the process of specialization and exchange made possible by limited and responsible government motivated an outpouring of productive effort that soon transformed a wilderness into the most prosperous nation in the world. The role the US Constitution played in this transformation was an important one, and can be explained both in terms of positive and negative incentives. He goes on, broadly speaking, there are two ways one can acquire wealth. One is capture existing wealth through non-productive transfer activities. And the second one is you can create new wealth through productive activities. The major strength of the Constitution is that it established positive incentives for the latter and negative incentives for the former. The most obvious form of non-productive transfer activity is private theft. The thief simply takes through force or stealth something that belonged to someone else. A primary purpose for establishing government is to outlaw private theft. But the power that government necessarily possesses, if it is to enforce laws against private theft, is a power that affords individuals or groups the opportunity to benefit through public theft, legal transfer activity, to phrase it more gently. And the more vague and ineffective the limits on government authority, the less difficult it is to acquire legal transfers through political authority and political activity. And the larger number of people who find this activity offering the greatest profit opportunity. While those who are successful at the transfer game can increase their personal wealth, in some cases significantly, it is obvious that the country at large cannot increase its wealth through transfer activity. What one person receives is what another person or group loses. No net wealth is created, and for this reason transfer activity is often referred to as a zero-sum game. In fact, more accurately, it is to be referred to as a negative-sum game. The attempts of some to acquire transfers and the predictable efforts of others to protect their wealth against transfers requires the use of real resources. These resources could be more productively employed creating new wealth rather than wasted in activities that do nothing more than redistribute existing wealth. For every dollar that one person receives from transfer activities, the rest of the community sacrifices more than $1. End quote. However, problems arise when the US government creates an environment which encourages economic entities to partake in public transfer activities. After the multitude of lectures most of you have attended about the banking crisis, most recently with Barnes, it seems unnecessary for me to elaborate on the matter, but one can easily see how the sale of debt and other such activities can be seen to be directly contravening the intentions of the founding fathers when they wrote the Constitution. I understand that when a government takes more money out of the hands of people, it makes it more difficult for them to buy things. If they can't buy things, the economy doesn't grow. If the economy doesn't grow, we don't put Americans to work. Mitt Romney said that. Can't believe he was elected president. And not a big fan of socialism, clearly. Professor Lee also writes, every economy is a political economy, and the enormous success of the US economy is as reliant on our political system as it is on our economic system. Now, much has been written about the pervasive distrust of how the pervasive distrust of government power led to the framing of a constitution that worked to limit government. What might be more important is that the constitution worked to limit government because of a healthy distrust of government power. And what I mean, for example, in the 1860s, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had its Harper's Ferry Railroad Bridge brought up all number of times by armies on either side of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate. And no time did it ask the government to pick up even part of the tab. Or consider the fact that in 1887, President Grover Cleveland vetoed an appropriation of $25,000 for seed corn to assist drought-stricken farmers with the statement, "It is not the duty of government to support the people." Surprisingly, there is little doubt that Cleveland's view on this matter was in keeping with broad public opinion. Reagan would later come to term this rugged individualism very importantly. So in short, there are three major deviations from the Constitution in my eyes, all of which, as I have explained, have serious negative ramifications for the US in modern times. A lack of democratic fairness, separation of church and state, and encouraging the right economic activities, and equally discouraging the wrong ones. And they have all had huge effects on the US, both domestically and in terms of how they affect other countries. And these are all avoidable problems. All that has to be done is to adhere to the Constitution and be counselled by the wisdom of those who framed it. Therefore, it seems the only fitting way to celebrate the wisdom of the Founding Fathers is to relate to you what Abraham Lincoln said to Congress. We, the people, are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Thank you very much. Any questions? Go ahead, Joe.
Isn't there a slight contradiction in advocating fairness as in democratic fairness, but then pursuing the economic line that Mitt Romney would be pursuing now in America? You called it rugged individualism, which is basically looking out for yourself.
Yeah. No, I think that's... I can see where you perceive there to be a contradiction there, but what they're saying, what they're talking about in terms of democratic fairness is the idea that government should be limited, and the government should be kept to the bare minimum. Not that the idea that the government should try and fairly distribute wealth or anything like that. I mean, you have to bear in mind also it's very hard to know what Mitt Romney would actually be doing now. He said a lot of things to get through his primaries, as all non-incumbent presidents do. But I think that they're perfectly compatible ideas. That you can both have parity in power in terms of actual citizen power, but economic freedom. And economic freedom to a great extent.
Do you think there's economic freedom in America at the moment?
Less so.
Than when?
Less so than when the Constitution was first framed. But I think a lot of that has been self-caused. I think the more one asks for government bailout, if the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had asked for the government to pick up its tab, eventually they would have come up with the government as they have now, the kind of democratic system of, the Democrats' model of government, whereby they bail out everything and everyone, and that kind of mollycoddling, spoon in the mouth form of government. But yeah, I think because of that, there is far less economic freedom. Because I think just by taking the help, you're taking away your own freedoms. So yeah, yes, I think there is less economic freedom. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for coming. You're all free to go. I thought it was meant to be like a